I want you to think about your place in your life right now. What do your relationships look like? What does your job look like? What does school look like? More importantly, what does your relationship with God look like as you stand in this place right now? And I want you to say to yourself, I cannot stay here. I cannot stay here. Now, I know when we come back here in a year, all of you will still be in the same spots because we are creatures of habit. But I hope that by the end of this message today, none of us will be praying that we will find ourselves in the same spot we're in today or next year. You can sit down. I was tempted to make you switch pews like my dad did one of his first Sundays here. Did you really? Shut up. Many of us, and I include myself in this, many of us like to stay where we are. It's comfortable. It's familiar. It's easy. Some of us are in places we know we shouldn't be, but we don't want to do anything about it, and so here we stay. And that's where I like to be because I like the familiar. But God does not want us to stay where we are because our journey with God is always about transformation, about moving forward, about being more like God tomorrow than we are today. And if we're going to be more like Jesus tomorrow, we cannot keep doing the same old thing that we're doing right now. We must continue to move forward. Today, we're going to continue in the book of Genesis. And we're going to see a story of a group of people who were told, you cannot stay here, but they did everything in their power to do just that. Right? Have you ever had God call you to do something and you're like, no thanks. God pushes us to grow, and we just dig our heels in and say, I am fine the way I am. Everything's going just great. We like to control our own lives. But today we're going to look at a passage of Scripture in Genesis 11. You can find it in your red Bible in the front of you. It's around page 7. Last week we left off with Superintendent Doug, Dad, preaching from Genesis 5 on Enoch. Today we're going to look at Genesis 11, but what happens in between? Genesis 6 through 9 is the story of Noah. Okay, I'm trying to get through the book of Genesis, and there's like 50 chapters, so I can't do everything. But the book, chapters 6 through 9 are about Noah, the flood. You guys remember the story? Okay, the earth is flooded. The whole earth is destroyed except Noah and his family. We get to chapter 9, and God tells Noah and his sons and their descendants what he wants them to do. And then chapter 10 describes the families of Noah's sons. So that's where we find ourselves in this story. Now, some of us know this story. This is the story of the Tower of Babel. So if you're a little bit familiar with the Bible, you may have heard this. You may have heard this in Sunday school. But let's pick it up. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 8. Maybe 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Do you hear that? They settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So let's look at a little bit of background so we can understand the context. Babel is a word that means confusion, gateway to a god. It's the origin of our English word Babel. Okay, do you remember when you had little toddlers at home? And they could have an entire conversation with you, but you have no idea what they actually said. Right? That's where we get this word from in the English. We believe that Nimrod, there's a name. I should have saved that for a boy. Nimrod. He's a descendant of Noah's son. Noah's, I think, great-grandson, if I have that correct in my head. He is a mighty warrior, and his dad wanted to establish his own kingdom. So Nimrod becomes the founder of the city of Babel. And Babel eventually becomes the empire of Babylon. And that empire would later destroy the nation of Israel, its temple, and send people into exile. If you remember a little bit more of your Old Testament, the people get scattered away from Israel because of this. Now, in the Old Testament, it was common for groups to build these towers. So I was thinking, why build a tower? Like, I don't sit in my office and go, I think I'll build a tower today. Right? But they used to build towers that were these lofty pyramid-type structures. They were typically square at the base and had staircases on the outside. And I didn't know this, but they often led to a small shrine at the top. And so here they are, and they decide they're going to build a tower. So let's look at why did they build the tower. The first reason is because they wanted to be famous. They wanted to make a name for themselves. Trying to think of a good example. It's kind of like Trump. Now, I do not preach politics, you all know this, but he sometimes has a need to build big things. And they're going to be the greatest and the best and the grandest and the tallest and the most famous, and then he puts his name on it, right? This is kind of what the people in Genesis 11 are doing. Now, I'm not saying what I think of Trump Tower. I'm just saying this is what the people were thinking. They were thinking, we want to be famous. So we're just going to build this big tower and make a name for ourselves. And don't we kind of live in a society like that today, where part of who we aspire to be as Americans is kind of a bit of an Western type thinking thing. I just want to make a name for myself. I know I'm doing well in life if I have lots of likes on my Facebook post or Instagram or new things I don't know about because I'm old. And now we aspire to be famous and well known. There's even jobs now where you can be a social media influencer. I don't know what that means, but it's a thing and you get paid to do it and you're famous. Now we hear young people, their aspiration is to be famous. Listen, sometimes I just want to hide, but They wanted to be famous. And don't we all kind of feel that in a little bit? Maybe not famous in meaning like everybody knows who we are, but we all want our lives to matter in some way. We all want to be important in some way, however you define that. We all want to have purpose. And so that is what they're striving to do, was to be famous. Second thing, they wanted to be like God. Here we are in chapter 11 of the Bible. We've only gotten 11 chapters in. And have you heard this story before? If you look at Genesis 3, what were Adam and Eve trying to do when they ate of the fruit? Trying to be like God. We are always trying to find new ways to be powerful and all-knowing. We all want control of our lives. None of us necessarily freely surrender to God. Right? That doesn't necessarily come naturally. It's something we must decide to do. We like for life to revolve around us. I've said this before, but one of the first words we ever learn is me and mine. Right? And I love it when we try to teach the concept of sharing to 2-year-olds because they don't understand it. Life is, in their minds, life is all about them. And we think, well, we should grow up and go past that. But let's be honest, often we want life to be about me. Thirdly, they thought they could get to heaven with their own efforts. How many times have we taken control back from God? For some of us, it's a continual struggle, continual choice we must make. Who will be in control of my life, me or God? We have told God to leave us alone. I think I've actually said those words. Just leave me alone. I'm doing just fine on my own. We don't need God to interfere in our lives. We sometimes forget that we can't just earn heaven. Right? There's nothing that we can do to make us good enough for heaven. It only comes through the gift of Jesus. Fourthly, reason they built this tower is because they practiced idolatry, which is the worship of something other than God, and their idol was them. And lastly, and the most hard for all of us, they wanted to stay where they were. Did you notice in the passage it says that they settled there? Here's what it said in Genesis 9:1. Genesis 9:1 is right after the flood. They've come out of the ark. God is giving Noah and his sons instructions. And he says this to them. God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Can you fill the earth if you stay and settle where you are? But they decided, well, they don't want to move. They don't want to change. They're comfortable. Let's be honest. Too many of us, and I include myself, have decided that we are going to stay right where we are. I don't need to grow. I'm going to stay right here. I've chosen behavior that I know is not pleasing to God, but I'm just going to stay here anyway because I like it. We don't seem to care to change it, and we're comfortable in the mess. I mean, you all know me. You know that I like things to stay the same. I like things to be boring. I have actually prayed this. I'm not saying this is what we should do, okay? This is not advice, But I have literally sat in my office and said, Lord, please just give me boring. Now, some of you aren't like that. Some of you are like, I need excitement and fun. I'm like, boring's fine. I'm completely fine with it. I will pray for it and it's great. And God's like, don't you think I have something better in mind for you? I have something better in mind, but here I am praying for boring because I like things to stay the same. But that is not what being a Christ follower is all about. This stubborn refusal to change or move forward in our lives is us digging our heels and saying, God, I'm going to stay right where I am. But here's what happens when we do that. If we continue to do what we shouldn't, or we continue to stay where we are, at some point, God might force the issue. Ever had that happen in your life? You know, I don't know why I don't learn the lesson that if I just did what God called me to do, life would be maybe not easier, but my soul would be better. But I like to stay where I am. So here's what happens as a result of the people building this tower. One of the first things that happen is that the people are scattered. The one thing they're trying to avoid, right? They're trying to avoid it, and in the end, it was an epic fail. Have you ever tried to do the one thing God told you not to do? And you realize, oh, that was a big mistake. And yet then the next day we do the same thing all over again. We somehow don't learn our lessons. I'm a bit thick-headed sometimes. And God said, well, you tried all this time to keep things the same, but I've now forced it. And the people are separated. Then God gives them a different language. Different languages. You realize at the beginning that they all speak one language. And when you all speak one language, isn't it easier to get things accomplished? I mean, it's just simpler. It's easier. There's a bit more unity. But now, because God has separated languages, separated people are separated, it looks like by clan. Now there's disunity and people running from each other. Have you ever been in another country where you didn't speak the language? Some of you, this is your second language. I remember my first mission trip as an adult. In 2010, I went to Cuba, and don't listen to this part. I did not. That is true. Jorge and Maria allow us to cheat and not know the language because they translated everything for us in their graciousness. But I'm going to admit something that I shouldn't. That first trip to Cuba was very difficult for me. Now, that's not to say there were not great memories, and of course, the highlight of that trip is meeting Jorge and Maria and Pastor Javier and your beautiful church. But it was hard for me, and I was hit with culture shock like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. And if you said to me, what does culture shock feel like? I could not describe it. I could not figure out how do you put into words what I was feeling that first trip to Cuba. And when I was in Cuba this last time, not quite a year ago, Josh Avery's wife, Carissa, actually put it into words for me. Carissa has traveled quite extensively. She's been to many, many countries. And she said during one of her time with, I forget which organization she was with, but she was in one country and she had to go to another country. She said, I was hit with culture shock like I've never ever had anywhere else. And I said, tell me what it felt like. How do you describe it? She goes, I don't know, but all I could think was I want to be anywhere but here. And I remember at moments in that trip, and it had nothing to do with the people. It was just, I was just hit that hard with it that I remember thinking, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. It was different. I didn't understand what was going on. People were speaking Spanish. I know one word. I know you're shocked by this, but I like predictable and familiar. Cuba is not. And I remember coming home and going, I will never go back to Cuba again. I have got to stop saying never to God because it really ends up backfiring on me. Because I've now gone back 4 times. I've fallen in love with Cuba. I love my Cuban brothers and sisters. I've been to the Philippines. I've been to the Middle East, and I never experienced it again. But what that trip did was teach me reliance on God. And that's what these people in Genesis 11 are trying to avoid. And what God does is he takes away that self-reliance so that they must somehow find a way to trust God. So lastly, if you looked at the scripture at the very end, God looked at the earth and said they believe that nothing is impossible for them. They believe that. And so if I take away their sense of security, their common language, their common location, then they will learn reliance on me. God wants to teach us that there are some things that are impossible in our own strength. You know, when we sent in that application to bring Jorgito here, that is impossible. What we have asked God for is impossible. And I am trying to trust, just like we sang today, that song, Do It Again. I'm praying that God is going to move mountains. I would prefer it if it was quicker, not lying. But we're praying for it. And I remember a time, I've shared this story, you all know, many of you know the story. But there are times in my life when God has forced change on me that I didn't necessarily ask for. And in those moments, we can choose to follow God or not. I remember in January of 2017, some of you are really familiar with this time frame in the life of us and our church. It was a Saturday. I was preparing to leave for Cuba on a Tuesday. Many of you were on that team with me. And that Saturday, I sat in a room in Washington, Pennsylvania, next to Bishop Roller and a group of people that made up the superintendency search committee. And I sat in that room, and our job was to find a new superintendent. And I sat in that room, and I kept hearing this name, Doug Raby. And I was like, oh, no. And we talked for a little while, and then they excused me from the room, so if people felt like they needed to say something about him, they could. And I thought I'd be gone for a few moments. An hour and a half later, I finally came back up the stairs. And I remember leaving that room going, my life as I know it is done. Like, I think it's done. I think that they're going to nominate this Doug Raby guy to be the next superintendent. And what happens with that is I am no longer the associate pastor of this church. That, like, change was happening, and I could do nothing to stop it. Now, I could have been the associate pastor of this church until the day I died. I would have been. That would have been fine. It was comfortable. I was okay at it. People didn't hate me. It was fine. And I never felt that I was not in the will of God. It wasn't like I was having this argument with God. That there had been a few times. I'm not that popular, but a few times another couple pastors would come to me and asked, "Would you ever consider coming to our church?" And I just was always like, "No, I'm at Monacrest, and that's what God has called me to do." But God had other things in store, and he knew that I might not have necessarily volunteered for them. Sometimes God will come into our lives and interfere. Sometimes, if we are sticking our heels and saying, I'm not changing, I'm staying right here, God can sometimes come in and say, I've got a big change coming. I want you to move forward in your life. Sometimes those moments of being uncomfortable, which some of us hate, are because God has better things in store for us. And so here is the question for us today. Will we stay where we are? Do we want to look back on this day in 1 year and say, I'm exactly the same that I was? Or will we be able to say, look at what God has done? I allowed God to come into my life and make a change, and I have been transformed. We'll never quite arrive, right? The journey's never done till we reach heaven. But God says, I don't want you to stay in the same place. I have something better for you. It might be more uncomfortable or more unfamiliar. It may not go along with your map. I like pretty blueprints and GPS and clear directions. And sometimes God says, I just want you to follow after me. Don't be those people that built a tower in order to keep things the same. Will we stand up and say, God, I want to be in a different place?